Hey everybody, welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from somewhere in the state of Washington. I am introducing Paul Austin, CEO, founder of Third Wave. We did a fun podcast together when we were in Las Vegas for the Remind conference. This episode was also aired on his platform, Third Wave. I think it's called the Psychedelic Podcast now. I think there was a change in the name. So check that out as well. And today on the show, we actually compare our programs. We compare Vital and Paul's Third Wave coaching program and, talk a little bit about our history together. We've known each other for quite a long time now. And yeah, it's fun. It's a fun one because of all the compare and contrast and, learning what's the right program for you. So check out what he's got going over at the Third Wave. Check out the podcast and, see if you like what he's got going on. All right, everybody, I think that's it for now. Thanks for tuning in to Psychedelics Today. We will see you on the other side. Appreciate you all. Bye-bye. Here we are, Remind, Las Vegas. Paul Austin, how you doing?
2023. It's been a journey.
Oh my gosh. It's been a lot of years. I feel like you're one of the first people I knew in the space, actually.
Yeah, when we probably connected at maybe Horizons in 2016. After you showed me that photo last night of us, playfully duking it out in 2017, I was like, yeah, I started Third Wave in 2015 and then started going to conferences in 2016. We probably met somewhere in that time because I know we both started our podcast around the same time. And early on, you and Kyle were probably the 10th or 11th guest that I had on the show. And I know we did something on microdosing back in 2016, 2017 for Psychedelics Today. So it's interesting to see how the space has developed, how our respective platforms have developed. And we've found ourselves, I think, tracking on fairly similar paths, but with, some unique ways of approaching whether it's training or media or, other things, philosophies. So I think that'll be a cool thing to unpack and dive into today is what has Psychedelics Today become? Who has Psychedelics Today become? And respectively, I can also, talk to that for Third Wave.
Yeah. Yeah. And Third Wave isn't your only projects, right? You're up to a lot.
It's kind of like Psychedelics Today and Vital, right? Where Vital is its own sub-brand in many ways. And I think, we really look at what's the larger tent that our respective brands represent, and then what might be really interesting projects that can be launched into those communities because a lot of trust has been established. And it feels like that as a business model it's a slower build, but it's a much more sustainable and integrative build because it's much less, in the long term, it's much less risky because the chances of becoming a billion-dollar company are slim to none, but also the chances of going bankrupt and going out of business are slim to none. And so you sort of hedge those risks and those bets. And I've always thought about Third Wave in and of itself as I'm really looking at how are we building this for the next 25, 30, 35 years rather than what are we accomplishing, in the next 3 months or the next quarter or something like that. And having sovereignty and freedom like we both do allows us to do that. Because a lot of these publicly traded companies or companies that have raised a bunch of money from VCs or investors, they don't have that same level of autonomy.
No, it's just really rough in this space because you come in with, your ideology and you're kind of glowing. You're like, this is going to be the best. And then, well, you have to act that way.
Yeah.
And that's really hard. That's not really what we thought we were going to get into. Thankfully, we're both not living in that space.
Right.
Yeah. And I think you're right. Developing a long-term plan to build a brand and then building products and stuff into that. Yeah, absolutely. We started developing training just because we're we're not really thinking of this as a business yet. We started developing training just to pay our hosting bills.
Right.
It's do I really want to pay that much a month? Not really. Let's try to sell some classes. And it was for college kids. No real intent behind it other than helping college kids have an easier time. And it's just funny that I remember way back you were developing kind of kits, microdosing kits. Are you guys still doing those?
No, we were just drop shipping those from a dude in the UK, and then he stopped doing them. So we did that for a little bit. Recently, we've rolled out mushroom grow kits. So we'll send a grow kit to your home so you can grow your own mushrooms. We don't send that with spores because that would be illegal. But I'm always looking for how do we create accessibility without breaking the law? What are educational frameworks we can provide? And and we'll probably get into this in the conversation. There's like, in any sector or industry or any subculture, there's sort of these principles of morality, the do's and the don'ts. And many of them, especially in the psychedelic space, are worth paying attention to. And some of them, I think, can often be counterproductive, right? And so I've always wanted, through Third Wave and through the projects, it's like, be beholden to great work, help people, come from a great place, mean well, create community and trust, but don't get caught up in a lot of the extra dialogue because it can often be distracting. And I'll go on the record as saying, which this may be controversial to say, I think one of the reasons Synthesis, which was a company that I co-founded in 2018, we've heard about how they went bankrupt and all that. And I think a big reason they went bankrupt is because they were trying to create sort of a certain external appearance. And that led them to not make the difficult and hard decisions that they needed to make in order to keep the business alive and healthy and thriving. So obviously there's more complexity than that, but I do think it's important to stay focused on creating great products and great services, helping people, and ignoring most of the noise that people get caught up in, where it's like, well, you should say this, or you should act like this, or this is PC, or this isn't I'm like, like, let someone else worry about that.
Yeah. There's so much noise in this space and it's so confusing. I was chatting with some ketamine clinic investors yesterday, and they were just having such a hard time engaging in the room, like figuring out where to have conversations. And they said they were asking a straight up question to somebody and they're like, businessmen. They turned their back and walked away. It's like, well, no, guys, we need investors in this space. Like, we need more capital in this space. Like, I swear you might not believe me, but we do for a lot of reasons. So we need them.
So that's a great thing to touch on. What's been your approach with raising capital, not raising capital, bootstrapping? You have a reasonably substantial team. I think there's probably 8 or 9, maybe 10 people who work with you, for you, collaborate with you. And we were talking last night, and I was surprised to hear that you hadn't raised external funding.
Finally on the record. Yeah, we never raised money. Like, I was very, very into it for a long time. And I tried.
At what point, like in what years were you because this probably tracks, because I have a similar story. Like, what years were you like, oh man, if we could only raise like $1 million or $2 million, or if, we could get some of this funding that was coming in, like, did you attempt? Did you try? Was it just not a fit?
When was like peak? Was it first Wonderland was super peak?
Peak was 2020, end of 2021 into like mid 2022, probably like mid 2021 to mid 2022. I would say was probably peak.
It was going into that was when I was curious, because I had a 20-year software career. I very thankfully got laid off. I had the best powder year of my life, and then jumped into Psychedelics Today full time. And I'm like, okay, cool, this is great. Like, let's figure out how to make this work. Didn't click that investors would like make my world different or better, but somebody started like getting in my ear, yapping about it. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting, cool. Like, that'd be fascinating. And I tried a lot. And what was some of the interesting feedback was I don't see the venture scale. Like, I'm not going to get 5 to 20x back. Some really interesting hedge funds, or I guess family offices, were like, this is more of like a safety investment. This is like a hedge, like almost like a bond, like you were saying earlier. And that, like, you can't really super fail. Like, you could have a roller coaster ride for sure, but like, it could be so cheap to operate that we could do this forever. And I loved hearing that, but I'm also like, how do I want to relate to that? And eventually I'm like, I don't see the traction. I think we're still seeing okay money from education, which is great. And like, let's just try to make a go at it and do it ourselves and build our marketing team. And I'm certainly not a great marketer. I like to imagine I'm decent, but I'm not. And I think that was it. I said, okay, I can have more autonomy. I'm not going to lose too much here. I'm like, why should I go for it? And I go in waves now, because we're usually operating so like so thin.
Same.
That we're like, well, how are we really going to, grow in meaningful ways to like continue to help the space and ourselves and everybody else. And like, how are we going to do that? And so it comes back. Like I keep flirting with the idea, but I'm like, it's like when you meet somebody that you think might be an amazing partner, but the timing is just like 6 months off for both of you. Right. And you're like, this just might not fly.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what I've been feeling. Like, if it was 6 months earlier or later, like this would have been the best thing ever. But I'll probably enter back into that arena maybe within a year or two. I just want to make sure my investors are super aligned. Because, like we were saying earlier, you can get really co-opted. And then, aligned. And, that's probably it. Like aligned. And they're out there. Like there are folks that believe in what you're doing with all sorts of cash that are just kind of like waiting for the right situation.
Yeah. I mean, we had a similar thing. I raised a little bit of capital in 2019, 2020. Like small check sizes around 25K, give or take, from 10 or so people. And that was just helpful to create a stronger base, to hire, roll out, make some changes to the brand, these sorts of things. And then I was like, all right, I think, it was late 2020, early 2021. I remember I was living in Montana at the time. I was like spending a month in Whitefish. And, the company was thin on cash. And I'm like, either I got to figure out how to raise more funding. And I was having a lot of conversations with a lot of people and getting a lot of the same feedback that you were getting, which is you're already revenue positive. We don't necessarily see the opportunity for this to scale huge. You're sort of in a middle ground. And I think a lot of people thought, oh, he's a great, let's say the business people were like, he's a great activist or a great speaker for this, but is he a great CEO? Right. And a businessman. And so what I did is when I could not raise, I was like trying. It wasn't happening. This was early 2021. I got a loan and I basically was like, okay, it's like do or die. Like we have to launch something else that is going to get us through this next phase. And so that's when we launched our training program for coaches. And I think we rolled it out in May 2021 and then started our first cohort in June 2021. And we enrolled 22 people in the first cohort. It was, I think early bird was 8K and, the main price was 10K. And so it brought in enough cash then to like, okay, we're good for the next little bit. And now, the training program that we have is a substantial percentage of our revenue because it is a huge point of interest for a lot of people. And about a year ago, I brought in an investor for Third Wave and he's like, look, you have two businesses here. You have Third Wave, which you're trying to make into like a scalable educational platform or booking platform. So we rolled out a directory of providers. We now have a private community through an app called Mighty Networks. You can go into the App Store and download the Third Wave app and connect with people from all over. But he's like, that's a scalable investment-backed model. Your training program is not necessarily, meaning it could probably cap at $5 to $7 million a year, but you should just run it as a cash flow business, bootstrap it, don't raise investment for it because sometimes investment can fuck things up, right? It can be problematic. And so we've done that. We now basically have two different entities. And the intention is for Third Wave to continue to grow and develop. And for the Psychedelic Coaching Institute is the new brand that we rolled our training program out under, for it to continue to focus on doing great trainings. We'll probably roll out like a level 2 program as well, which I'm happy to talk with you about. Just don't steal my ideas.
Oh, we're already doing level 2. No, we're not actually doing level 2. We've just been talking about it for 2 years. But
wait, what's your level 2, Joe?
We're calling it the Psychedelic Coaching Institute program. No, just kidding. So we haven't really pinned down exactly what we want to do yet, but we want to get more niche with people. So like, say you're a physician that came through Vital. We're putting physicians and coaches and everybody else through the same curriculum, which is cool for a lot of reasons. And then imagine like a niched program by like profession, perhaps, or like a cohort of professions. I think there's something interesting there. I think just having people from different backgrounds together is a bit of magic. That's why we like these kinds of conferences, because we get to talk to the growers, the underground people, whoever, and learn a lot, right? And it's kind of the same thing. Like, oh, this physician now gets to talk to this person, and they get to understand like a normal user's perspective, as opposed to like, staying in physician land and being kind of like an island and not understanding the rest of culture, which can happen often in physicians, and vice versa, like people actually understanding physicians and all the things they have to deal with. Yeah. So,
well, and like I love that concept. It's like the technical term that I interviewed Jonathan Saba from Journey Clinical for this, and he talks about it as a collaborative care model.
Yeah.
Right. Where I find with our program, I'm sure you find the same with Vital. It's like people come in thinking they want X, and they leave having gotten Y. Right. Oftentimes they come in thinking, okay, I just want to know how to do preparation. I want to know how to assess. I want to know, the key and fundamental aspects of integration. And all of that is important to cover in any sort of training program for coaches. For sure, you need to like cover those basics. And what I find time and time again is people need way less information than they think they need.
Right.
And they need way more sort of courage and just a willingness to go out and make stuff happen. And so a lot of the relationships that are then formed in these cohorts that we have, people will then go out and start to collaborate and do things together out in the real world. They'll start retreats together. They may,
How cool is that?
It's fantastic. And it's just sort of like emergent, and people tend to find their way. You don't need to make specific introductions. People find their own way in that. And that's why I love the cohort model. And that's probably, a key difference between ours and the current Vital is, from what I understand, we should talk about that. Like, what are some of these differences? Because for us, it's like,
well, maybe let's set the table. Like, what is your program?
Okay. All right.
And then I'll do mine, and then we can.
All right. Yeah, because the thing is, just for the audience that are listening, we're planning to publish this on both of our podcast platforms. And so initially, Joe and I were talking about, well, how about Joe interviews Paul and Paul interviews Joe? And then I was like, what if we just did a longer form interview where we can go into a lot more deeper stuff, rather than it feeling like, okay, quick, and quick, because we're at this conference and we gotta make shit happen. So what I noticed in 2021, when I was looking at the landscape of training programs at that point in time, is all of them, basically without exception, were focusing on, let's say, the clinical, therapeutic, or medical use of psychedelics. And there's different twists on that. That doesn't mean everyone is medicalized, but there is an orientation on trauma healing, an orientation towards a trauma-informed, let's say, program. There is a focus on how this could be helpful for depression, addiction, PTSD. And a lot of the faculty of programs, they tend to be medical people. Right? They tend to be people who are doctors or psychiatrists or psychologists or social workers or researchers who are really explicitly focused on the therapeutic use. And so I was like, my background in this space has always been, I've been much more interested in leadership, performance, and well-being, right? How can psychedelics not just help us heal trauma, but how can they help us to become better parents? How can they help us to become better leaders? How can they help us to take better care of ourselves? That's always been more of my focus. And so I was like, I would love to create a training program for coaches who are not necessarily looking at just the trauma healing and therapeutic side, but are really looking at the whole entire picture of what it means to be human. And yes, there's shadow work that often needs to be done. And yes, there could be some healing that needs to be done, even with CEOs or entrepreneurs or executive leaders who think they're coming into psychedelics for this reason. They often are taught something different, but keeping that sort of broader lens. And so what I did was I was very intentional then about choosing, well, who do we want as faculty? Right? Who do you want to bring in as facilitators? And so what I chose to do was choose faculty who have clinical credentials, who, we have 2 MDs, we have a doctor of Chinese medicine, we have 2 clinical psychologists, there's a few other folks as well. And almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them, they were a doctor for 10 years, or they were a therapist for 20 years, or they, worked in that lens. And at some point, they were like, this feels limiting, right? This feels like there's so much more that I could do rather than just one-on-one work or rather than just healing work. There's something else that wants to come through. So a lot of them got into coaching. And coaching is much more about like the quest or the objective or the thing that we're reaching out into rather than the story or the narrative of what's happened to us in the past. And so that, I think, was my intention, and to really gear it specifically towards executive coaches, holistic health coaches, life and relationship coaches, and then some clinicians who feel like, I don't want to just do clinical work. I really want to start to get into a more expansive space with the work that I do. And what we found also to be true is a lot of people enroll who, they've maybe been in a corporate work environment for many years and they've had a transformative experience at psychedelics. And they're like, I'd like to maybe do a career transition and work more with this as well. So we also accept some folks who might not have a coaching background, but are really looking at a career transition. And we make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. And for me, the North Star of the program, or the sort of ethos or focus, is like inner transformation leads to external mastery. And what that means is, we can give you all the theory. We can teach you what we call the 5 key elements: assessment, prep, experience, integration, and microdosing. We can teach you different models, different frameworks. But if you don't actually walk the path yourself, then you aren't really being of full service to the clients that you want to potentially work with. And so what we emphasize again and again is it's important to walk the walk. It's important to have a beginner's mind as you come into the space and come into this training program. It's important that also we emphasize, individual responsibility, that sometimes there can be challenges or difficulties. So to communicate those, to speak up about those is important. And the main focus of the program, which we'll do about a week after recording this, we go to Costa Rica and do a 6-day intensive with all the coaches. So they fly down there and we essentially do a microdose, which is a nature hike, silent nature hike with a low dose of mushrooms, a temescal, which is a sweat lodge and a clay thing, high dose psilocybin ceremony, and then like a hot springs as like an integration day, and then weave other aspects and elements into it. And the whole idea is we do it at a center in Costa Rica called Brave Earth. The whole idea is to bring them into it's like in the middle of the jungle in Costa Rica, right? Bring them into deep nature. Look at how psychedelics can be an opener to connect even deeper to nature, and do it in a really safe and transformative container where they leave that feeling both like their internal world has been transformed, but also, as we talked about before, the collaborations and the bonding that have been established with the rest of the cohort will really serve them from this point forward. And then the final part of the program, so we have theory first, where we cover like safety and ethics and the history of psychedelics and, the difference between microdosing and higher dosing and what are the intentions for integration and the legal landscape and all these things. And then our practicum is 6 months. And in the practicum, what we do is we just cover, like I said, those 5 key elements. So how do we spend a month on assessments? If a client's coming in, how do you assess them properly? A month on preparation, a month on facilitation, which we don't emphasize. What we tell folks coming in is this is not a training program for if you want to become a guide. There's a lot of people who do join who want to become guides. We emphasize this is about the prep and the integration. This is about the coaching. This is not about guiding, because I think a lot of people get confused about that distinction and that difference. But it's still important to cover aspects of facilitation. So even if you're a coach, you know what to look for if you're going to recommend that your client go somewhere. And then we have a month on integration and a month on microdosing. And that's like our current, what I would say, level 1. It's our flagship. It's what we found a lot of success with. And what I'm looking at as a level 2, we've thought about that as well. Like maybe it could be profession specific, like you were mentioning. Maybe it could be even outcome specific, meaning if you want to work with microdosing, we have a one for microdosing. If you want to work and specifically be high integration for high dosing, we have one for that. If you want to work with another sort of way, it could be indigenous use, you have one for that. But for now, the level 2 I'm really looking at is a training program on how to guide psilocybin experiences. And not, again, as an entrepreneur, I'm always looking at when everyone is zigging or when everyone is zagging, how do you zig? There's a lot of training programs that are coming out for guides. I see like a new one every week at this point in time. And almost all of them are really focused on the deep one-to-one work because that's the model that the FDA has approved. That's what's often talked about in Oregon. And yet one-to-one work is not scalable and accessible, has been always my sense. So we're really looking at how do we roll out a level 2, which is a training program for guides to guide small groups. You know, it could be 6 to 10 people in collaboration with other facilitators and holding that space rather than the deep one-to-one work, because that's really within our ethos at Third Wave is I want to focus on programs and training that I think are in alignment with accessibility on a broad scale and helping students know how to guide or just hold space in a group container, I think is a great way to accomplish that.
It's dope. Yeah. I like the structure. I like the way you're doing it. It's fun. There's a lot of overlap, obviously. Yeah. Anything else you want to jump or?
Oh, I mean, the only thing I would say is with these training programs, they're like still evolving. Ours is still figuring out fully what it wants to be. There's always slight changes and iterations. And that's how any organism should be, right? An organism is, if you're not growing and evolving, you're dying. In some ways, there's no such thing as being static. And so I think that sense of aliveness that we bring into it is also really important. And again, what I emphasize is there's no prescription, right? We often want a prescription. Just tell me what to do. What's the cookie cutter model? If I have a client, just give me like, I want to do this, this, or this, and I'm good. I'm like, no. Like you got to learn yourself. You got to know the different aspects and elements, but at the end of the day, this has to be yours and only yours and fully yours, because that's the only way to really be a great practitioner or facilitator.
Right.
There are no cookie cutter models when it comes to psychedelics.
Learn the rules so you can break them. Also, one thing I think often about is how little broad agreement there is even in psychology around theories of mind, behavior, etc. It's even worse in psychedelics. It's a very fragmented space.
What, just with like default mode network, salience network, or somatics versus psychoanalysis?
Default mode network, that explains everything for me. Yeah, exactly. So like, fundamental theories on what's going on, like, to what degree are the DMT entities influencing my LSD trip? Who knows?
Substantially, clearly.
Yeah. That explains it.
I just want that DMTX. That's what I want.
You're in?
Oh, yeah. If you can give me intravenous DMT and I can just be in that space for
how long?
I'd probably do it for like an hour.
Yeah, I think that's there. Right around where they're starting.
Yeah.
I think so.
Have you tried it?
No, I never shot DMT. It'd be interesting for sure.
Have you smoked DMT?
Yeah, a few times. It's pretty neat. That stuff.
It's interesting. Yeah.
There's something really curious about it for sure. But, that's the kind of stuff that challenges our assumptions about, is my theory of mind right?
Right.
Is this all just coming from my cells and like weird emergent phenomena? Perhaps. But, we need a lot more science before we like have hard answers.
Well, I'm glad you're bringing this up because there's often wisdom in tradition and lineage. And that's why it's so important that a lot of the quote unquote science and psychology is balanced with how indigenous cultures and ancient cultures worked with psychedelics and have worked with psychedelics for thousands of years, because clearly they're doing something correct. And so instead of getting caught up in theories, it could be this, it could be that. It's very much a mind activity and not actually all that useful for real transformation. What are the containers that indigenous peoples and, even the ancient Greeks created that allowed for transformation, right? Because there will always be disagreement about things that are this recent, about anything that's sort of cutting edge from a scientific perspective. But I don't think there's disagreement necessarily in the psychedelic space. I mean, I'm sure there is, but there's disagreement about everything. But by and large, people would agree that a safe container is important, right? Intentional use is important. If you're working especially with ayahuasca, having lineage and sitting with a curandero is important. So I think paying attention to those elements rather than, well, what about this theory of mind versus that theory of mind? A lot of that is just noise for anyone who wants to be serious about, I think, real transformation as a practitioner.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time with this stuff, so I think there's so much to it. So the idea that a practitioner should ignore the science is wrong. The idea
Correct.
that they should enter the debate, I think, is right. because it's fruitful for ways in which it might improve their practice if and when they can experiment with things and employ things that comes from the research more. Like, oh, the data isn't so great here, so let me try this one. Oh, interesting. I had better performance. Great. So it's kind of like, finding your path forward with science, even if you might not agree with like the sentiment of any individual paper.
Well, and research can be useful in that way. Like an interesting anecdote is in our last intensive, we had we do a high dose psilocybin ceremony in a Maloka, and we had one woman who had a couple comorbidities. She was a little older, a little more overweight, and also had a history of not epilepsy, but seizures. And we gave her a very low dose of psilocybin, right? Very low dose, but it still substantially impacted her. And so one of our facilitators did research on it right after and was like, oh, I found this research paper that shows that if there are more than 2 comorbidities and the person is potentially elderly, you need to be very cautious and careful about the potential use of psilocybin within that context and container. I never would have known that. I've facilitated a lot. I've been in this space a long time. I never would have known that. And yet having that research then shows, oh, okay, now this is a way that we can approach it differently, right? And so I think having that sort of accountability or sense of, oh, okay, this is what the research shows, there is something useful here, is important. I think more what I'm talking about is too much emphasis and too much focus on theory and getting caught up in sort of the head games of that and debating it and discussing it. It's interesting. We do it on the podcast, but when you're a practitioner and a coach in a transformative container, theory goes out the window, right?
Especially arguing about theories.
Theories.
Yeah, because you don't get traction there in your inner process, I don't think.
Right.
Necessarily.
It's much more experiential, and we want it to be experiential because it is about a process that we're living through. It's not a process that we're thinking through.
Yeah. All right. So process. That's one of my favorite words.
So Vital. Okay. So I saw Vital come out. What I was most impressed with when Vital came out was the branding.
It felt like I found some sort of branding wizard.
I agree. I remember, and I think one of the women who worked in it Maria had worked with us for a little bit, had like helped us out with our newsletter.
Amazing.
And I remember prior to that, I was like, with Psychedelics Today, I was like, the branding's fine. It's okay. It gets the job done. It clearly wasn't a focus or an emphasis necessarily. But then when that came out, I was like, I like the name. The design of the little rhombuses and circles is really cool. And the offering was very aligned, different, but very aligned as well in terms of what we've talked about and discussed. So I'd be curious, like, A, where did the name Vital come from? Why'd you choose it? And then B, just as I did, tell us a little bit about the intention of the program, the structure of the program, and maybe even like, this is, I think, the 3rd year you're doing it. You have a 3rd cohort that starts in January. Is that correct? And you're enrolling for that now.
Mm-hmm.
So what have maybe been some of the what have been some of the hard lessons and learnings from the first 2 cohorts? And I can actually share mine as well.
Yeah. So the origins here for Vital, Kyle and I have been in the space for quite a bit. I started studying LSD psychotherapy pretty hardcore in 2001.
With Groff?
Groff's books.
Groff's books. Okay.
Yeah. There was some reference in a Philosophy 101 course that I was taking to Groff. And the story was like, it looked like Exorcist meets Poltergeist. And I'm like, is this real? I'm in college. They're supposed to be teaching me true things. So I went to the library. Thankfully, small state school in New Hampshire, we had 4 Groff books, which is crazy. So luckily, I was able to just start digging in, which was not easy as a freshman to dig into pretty dense clinical literature. So it took me a while, but I started going on all the forums, digging in, found my community in the Groff world and through breathwork and stuff, and it's been great. So that's our origin point. And then Groff has been part of our whole thing. Originally I'm fawning over maps, but really I wanted to do the Groff training. That's where I think the structure of that training is so good for this work. It used to effectively be psychedelic training. They just wouldn't call it that. That's what Doblin told me at one point. So we always say what would they have done? And that's kind of what we have tried to do. So we wanted to make sure people had a training that we thought would outpace MAPS and CIIS. Those were our specific targets to I want to perform better than them. So as usual.
And perform for what intention or for what reason? Because I think that's an important
we just want them to have
particular.
better content.
Gotcha.
So MAPS specifically is developing facilitators, right?
For MDMA assisted psychotherapy.
For one drug, right? Like the Groff program is 2 years. There's no drugs and it's just breath work, right?
And you did that yourself?
I've not done the Groff stuff. All of my training effectively has been with Dream Shadow in Vermont. They're all close with Stan and, got the thumbs up from Stan to operate. So very similar training, just far more apprenticeship. Like the level of apprenticeship Kyle and I got there is just not to be understated. It was insane. So good. So if 2 years for breath work is the bare minimum, and some programs are pushing people out to be like real facilitators in like a short period of time, like that doesn't feel great. But like, how can we contribute in a 1 year frame? Because it's not like we can just say, oh, here we are with a 5 year program. That doesn't work. It's not practical. We started with 1 year, which is pretty ambitious, coming from 47 hours, 9 weeks.
That is ambitious. Yeah. I think our first cohort was like 4 months.
Dude, this is a lot. So like 9 weeks is our program with Navigating Psychedelics that we've been teaching forever. 47 hours. You've been a contributor there too. How do we make that jump? We're like, oh, we just upskill. We just make the real gamble. And like this was instead of investors. Like let's really roll the dice on this and really see what we can pull off. And the branding was great. And people came over and it worked. And we were able to attract all sorts of top talent. And what's interesting is, we thought we were just going to make an educational program. What we ended up making was, like you were saying earlier, a transformational educational experience where people know far more about themselves at the end of the program than they did at the beginning. They know perhaps where they will fit in the scene better.
Right.
You start out gung-ho, like I'm going to move to Costa Rica and start a retreat and facilitate full time. You're like, well, maybe I just want to do prep,
right,
or integration work or whatever it is, right? Or work in biotech because novel molecules are pretty interesting sometimes.
Yeah.
So we also started with a foundation of inclusion. We, in our experience teaching Navigating Psychedelics, kept seeing how magical it was for people with licensure, like therapists, psychologists, doctors, to be in the room with yoga teachers, life coaches, whatever it was. And there was a really interesting chemistry there. So we wanted to amplify that and not have it be purely clinician focused. Because when clinicians are together, I think they get tighter. Like there's a lot of like contraction. You're like, I'm going to shrink who I am and play my role as licensee versus play my role as fully expressed human, which is like, we want people to be more fully expressed. We want people to like really say what they believe and ask all the questions they need to ask, not just be like, I'm a therapist, so this is my only scope of practice. I'm only concerned with this little circle. It's a big circle. But, like there's other things in there. And so we wanted to be able to challenge those assumptions. We wanted folks to, get exposure to everything from like ancient psychedelic history to like the 60s to the research back then and now. And also have instructors. So we pulled rock stars from everywhere, right? So anywhere we could get like a big name that's published a bunch or has recognition or contributed to major ways that we like. We tried our best to get them to be kind of our weekly guest lecture. So we do a lot of those. So that's usually like hour and a half plus a Q&A period with all of our students. And then people would then break into their kind of, lack of a better word, homeroom groups. So we would have you with 2 kind of support staff and somewhere between, I think, 12 to 20 students in each group. And they would be able to debrief on that week's material, both in that lecture and whatever the homework was from the previous week. So you could kind of have a sort of learning and processing group. And what we've noticed is like the bonding that happens. And you've probably seen very similar stuff. Like we were seeing it in a 4-week program, never mind a year. It's like, they're almost family at the end. It's shocking. You're like, let's move in together. I'm like, well, not yet. But it's fascinating to see what people have done. They've started retreats, they've started businesses. Like I think some people are now at a fund. It's just, it's amazing, really.
And tell us about the retreat that you have as part of it. Because I know it's, from what I understand, when I was doing some research on it, it's like you have 4 or 5 or 6 different retreats that people can attend as part of that.
I like your model though. One big retreat. I like that.
It's simpler. Yeah.
So logistic heavy to do retreats.
Retreats are very logistic heavy. And then if you don't fill all the spots, then it's, because I noticed that as well. It's like, you'll enroll, and I'd love to hear the sort of, I'm sure it's just to help with covering cash flow and whatnot, but like, so you have these different retreats. I think one is like for breath work, one is for psilocybin, one is for maybe ketamine, or...
We're working on ketamine. We'll probably have that as an option this year, over 24. Yeah, I guess we don't include it in the price because it's so variable depending on what people want to pick.
Interesting. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So like, it's $5,000 to go here and get a single bedroom, or it's like $1,200 to go to this one. So we want to give people a lot of options. We also don't want to make it mandatory for people to have to consume drugs for whatever reason. So we made a breathwork option available with optional cannabis. We were doing that with Daniel McQueen in Boulder. We did another one like Everland Ranch outside Denver, which is super cool. I hope they recover and we can use them again. But it's a brilliant
what
space.
Happened?
Burners doing business. Like, it's.
Okay.
I don't exactly understand what happened there. Oh, you know what it was? The town started revolting. Super conservative, kind of like ranchy area. The first thing they did was like, I think the tenants moved in and took down like a large cross off the barn, and the neighbors didn't love that. But it's cool, right? It's like, not only is it a retreat center, but it's surrounded by Burning Man art in the woods. So they'll get like large installations and put it all in these woods in Colorado. It's beautiful. But yeah, I think it was a mix. That's what it was. They could only, by the county, have a few designated days for retreats per year. And that doesn't work as a business.
Not at all.
They're like, oh, you can only do 4. It's like, great.
Yeah.
What do I do with
that?
This
doesn't
whole
work.
Thing? No.
So you have these different retreat options. It's not included as part of the overall year-long program. Do you require people to attend a retreat in order to graduate still?
Okay. Yeah. So we started with these breathwork cannabis retreats in Boulder. That was really good. We did a few retreats partnered with Atman in Jamaica. That was pretty good. We like working with them. And then we wanted to include Europe. So we worked with Kiyumi. We might work with a group called Kaizen next year in Netherlands. And our retreat partner, Prasada, they've been really fun. Alice has, she comes from our breathwork world, Dream Shadow. She took Vital in our first cohort, and might have been the second cohort, I forget. But she was producing all of our retreats and said, like, I would like to do one on coastal Costa Rica. The resort like butts up to the water. It's gorgeous. It's going to be great. We did breathwork there. It was perfect. We just did one in Portugal, very similarly, just breathwork. But we're doing like breathwork, fitness. So we like have a movement like CrossFit coach that'll come. There'll be like yoga options, and that kind of stuff was neat because it's getting people embodied before big experiences is, I think, generally a boon to the process. But it's like, not everybody's at the point in their lives where they can get embodied. So that kind of stuff's really good, and that kind of shows a model of wellness. Like, here's what a wellness retreat would look like. And it's been a fun conflict because I'm like, it's a training retreat. It's not a wellness retreat, but because I want it to be as cheap as possible for folks to go to these. But also, by making it super cheap, you could lose out on a lot of lessons and available experiences, right?
And in your first cohort, I know I read something on LinkedIn. You provided a lot of scholarships. I don't know if you've done the same for the second cohort. How do you sort of approach the scholarship angle when it comes to the enrollments for Vital? And maybe even more broadly, how do you approach sort of curation of the group? Do you curate? Do you just sort of allow anyone to come in? What do you vet for? And again, I still want to hear, because I'll share mine as well. What are some of the hard lessons you've learned in building Vital over the last couple of years that might be good perspective from someone on the inside?
Yeah. So scholarship wise, last year, I think we did $511,000 in scholarship self-funded, which is pretty wild, probably to our detriment financially, because we only received a handful of donations to help back that.
Okay.
Yeah. But, we want to teach as many people as possible in our framework. It's not like, I wish I could say it's all about money. My life would be a lot simpler if it was all about money, but it's not. It's like a really big mission. And I think a lot of us feel it, and that's why we're here.
Yeah.
Like, what else is possibly so radically world changing?
Right.
It's like this and AI right now.
Exactly.
So
maybe together.
Yikes, but yes. So like we did that our first year too. I think we did about 170 to 250K year one, 511 last year.
Wow.
We received, I think, some donations from New Life to help cover. And like, was there other groups? I guarantee there's another group, and I'm sorry out there for not remembering. It's more about them. But yeah, like I think, in terms of like, how do we pick those people? We were going for geographic diversity, racial diversity, gender, sexual identity diversity, like all this kind of stuff. And what I thought was unique for us was like, you're disadvantaged. You live in like, super rural North Dakota. You need a scholarship. You're white. Like, we still want to help you. It's not just like exclusively, right, like BIPOC inclusion, like, which was big for us too. But we wanted to include like, where else do we need rock star players in the space? And we need rural people to be advocates, evangelists, et cetera, for their region. So for when legalization comes around federally or the state level, they can advocate smartly and, perhaps start clinics or whatever it is. So that's kind of our angle. We have people apply. They write a letter. We give them like a discounted application. I think we're already fully subscribed on scholarships this year as everybody, but try maybe. But yeah, it's an interesting process, and it's really at times gut wrenching. Say no, like we just ran out. I'm sorry, we picked so many amazing people. And it's not even necessarily about stack ranking. Like theoretically, a Harvard might want to theoretically, and how do you get through that? It's debate, regular debate, and discussion with your team about like, how does this line up with your values and like where you want to go, all that kind of fun stuff.
And lessons learned last couple of years. What are some of the hard ones?
Oh, lessons learned. Joe likes to go really fast, and he shouldn't always go so fast. What else? Things take more time than you'd think especially to get it really right. And I think a lot of people in this space would do well to learn from contemporary business practices and try to employ stuff that other businesses are using, because it will make your world easier. Like, for instance, if I had somebody, maybe not like a PMP, but somebody with some familiarity in project management helping with a lot of these projects, it would have been so much better.
And you didn't, at least to start with.
Like, I'm the one with project management experience, and it was like I was doing too much to manage the projects. Like, I used to manage all sorts of international software projects, and it was crazy. It was fun. It's great. But I'm wearing like not enough hats to have like deployed my skills there. So that would have made everything so much easier in terms of retreat planning, booking all the teachers for the whole year. Because, our schedules, like, sometimes people get sick and can't lecture, and who's the backup and all this kind of fun stuff, and who uploads the videos to the ed platform, all that. So things like that, if I went a little slower, which we're on year 3. So like we've learned everything really already. But people want super responsive customer service. And, we have effectively a dedicated customer service person now. And I'm in touch with them daily about like, here's what I think we should do with that person or whatever it is. And yeah, I think psychedelics aren't like, they're amazing. They are unique, but they're not like the thing that makes your business not need to follow normal human behavior. Right? Like, we need to fall into some sort of normalcy in the way we're showing up. And I think we thought that a few times. Like, oh no, we're so virtuous. Like, we're great. Like, no, you still need to function like a business, guys, and slow it down. And like, it's not just because you're doing good, it's going to work. Like, there's plenty of businesses that were doing good and are out now.
House of cards.
Yeah.
In a way, not enough SOPs, not enough structure. Right.
Agreed. That's what I was envious about with you. Like, I always knew that you were building a good foundation. I'm like, ugh, I wish I could have slowed down to actually build that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because the external is different than the internal, right? Because I look at my business and I'm like, oh, there's still a lot of, operational improvements. I think, for us, when I've looked at the training program, one is just managing expectations. Right? People come in, they want X, Y, and Z, or they're looking for X, Y, and Z. You've probably had this, like we've had it. There will be people who, maybe get disgruntled at some point in time, or this wasn't what I thought I paid for.
It can get wild.
Or and it's interesting because now I take an approach. We get very specific on like, we have an admissions interview. This is what it is. We clarify what it isn't and what it is. And then in our orientation, I also cover like, these are the agreements that we're making as part of this container. if you don't uphold these agreements, then you may be asked to leave the container. And I've had to ask very rarely. It's happened maybe we've had about 200 students go through. It's probably happened with 2 of them, but it does happen because what I've noticed is one person who is angry or disgruntled or looking to cause trouble or just trying to go toe to toe on like an ego bend with the teachers or facilitators. One person who does that could shift the entire energy of the cohort or the retreat, right? And so we really have to be impeccable about how we're welcoming people in, the expectations that we're sending. I found that to be the most difficult and challenging. And we're still learning things about like, small tweaks here and there,
Even saying something 10% differently.
Right.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's crazy. And it is this sense of, in a space like psychedelics, there's a lot of trauma sensitivity. There's a lot of sensitivity to word choice and language. And navigating that is important while not being sort of suffocated by it. So I'd say that's been one of the bigger lessons. I'd say the other big lesson for me, and this is probably more on the positive side, is I really love teaching and education and retreats. And I just find that when I think about Third Wave as like more of a media platform and the Coaching Institute as more of a training platform, I really find myself much more pulled to trainings, intensives, in person, because there's a lot more richness than just sitting behind a computer screen. But as you know, it's like content marketing, media, podcasts, email, newsletter, all of that is also really important if you want to, grow and
keeps
develop
the other things alive.
A training program, right? And we've probably both reached this point in time now where word of mouth for training programs like this is really important. We haven't done any paid advertising or public advertising. What I found to work really well is I'll go on a lot of podcasts that are not in the psychedelic space and talk about this. And so people will learn about it and come. We talk a lot about it on I saw you all do this as well. We talk a lot about it on our podcast as well. We interview old students or, things like that. So I think, this sense of not looking at this as like a massively scalable thing, but if we could train, upwards of 200 to 300 coaches and practitioners a year, that for me feels like a really good, from a business side, a really good model. And
it's about the numbers we hope for as well.
And it allows, I think, for a level of selectivity, because, the fundamental truth is when you put your stamp of approval on an individual, when you certify them, they represent your brand, they represent what you're up to, right? So they're also, I think, it can't be a rubber stamp, because it not only puts the potential people at risk in terms of who they might work with, but it also puts your brand at risk. And so I think that aspect as well of they deserve this, they went through a lot to get this, they met these certain requirements, and then they get certified as a result of that is important, especially in the psychedelic space.
Agreed. It's really it's not easy. In the holotropic breathwork world, it's very similar. You're like, you might go through the whole thing, but like if 2 or 3 of the elders there are like, no, you're not coming through, you could just, you could get really frustrated. But it's not necessarily like, hey, you're done. It's more like,
that's important.
Here's what we want you to do to like get to done.
You're not cut out necessarily.
Yeah. We just want you to do a little bit of finishing work. I don't actually know how that works at Vital. I know that's something we've chatted about a lot. Thankfully, what we have is we're not a facilitation training, right? We're just short of that. And as a result, thankfully, people aren't facilitating with our thumbs up. We tell them, we're not giving you the authority. If you want to take that authority, great, but it's not from us.
Right. So it's a certification for coaching.
We call it harm reduction and integration.
Interesting.
A certificate in harm reduction and integration. And like really, I suppose what's perhaps is slightly different is from yours in that you're kind of really focused on coaching, which is great. We're like really broadly focused. We kind of consider what we're doing a liberal arts degree in psychedelics. And we're like, okay, so what if the accountancy needs somebody who can speak to this population? Maybe they'll pick up a Vital grad, or a retreat center doesn't want just like somebody with a lot of legacy experience. They want legacy experience plus a training.
Right.
Or a branding company really needs to do that. Or, there's so many different like subcategories of jobs. That's kind of what we're seeing is like, there's so many jobs coming to psychedelics. We don't know if it's in 2 years or 10, but it's going to be a gigantic explosion in the next period of time here. And we both feel that, I think. And, we just want to seed good actors into all aspects. It could be from government to a lobby to, a fund.
Right.
Yeah.
So, we've been, when did you start Psychedelics Today? Was it 2015 or 2016?
Our first episode was May 2016. That's what I remember.
Okay. So 7 years now, a little more than 7 years.
7.5, yeah.
7.5. And, as we'll probably wrap up here in the next little bit, what are just some of the most interesting insights and perspectives and observations over the last 7 years as you've been in the space that you've noticed, that you've observed, that you've, reflected on? Kind of what have you learned? And what's that been like for you?
It's been weird. It's been good.
Psychedelics are weird, that's for sure.
So, what I loved early when I was going to Early Horizons, listening to too much Terrence McKenna, stuff like that, was I was really enlivened by how vital everybody was. Oh, there it is. Yeah. And how amazingly lit up they are by expressing their creative ideas. I think that was a big thing for me. And I believe kind of to a degree, we're seeing even more of that now. People are getting permission. Like the old timers didn't exactly need it, but like we needed a little permission this time around for whatever reason. And people are really running with amazingly creative ideas all the time. Like I'm sure you hear about at least one interesting thing a week. And you're like, oh yeah, hell yeah, that's awesome. They're doing that. I kind of wish I was doing it, but I'm glad somebody's doing it.
Yeah, like we have a few facilitators who went through our first cohort who are doing a Grateful Dead retreat.
Right.
Where they're going to create a whole sort of experience around dead music in ceremony with psychedelics, Yeah. So it's like, oh, that's
somebody
dope.
needs to research that. But I'm glad I did a little bit of that research on my own at Fish Show, so it was good.
Right.
But how do we bring in this novelty? And I think that's what I like is it's not just boring medical stuff. I'm still seeing an amplification in this like topic around the drug war and psychedelic exceptionalism. We just published a piece, I think, Healing While Harming, about like, yeah, cool, we're healing, but we're also at the same time as we're healing, we're strengthening the drug war and ruining families and whatever else, blah, blah, blah.
Interesting.
Anti-drug war talk.
Who wrote that?
So that was by, I think, Clayton Ikes.
Okay.
He's a Boulder guy. I can connect you later with him if you'd like. And it's, this is the thing I've been talking about, like Carl Hart, like all this kind of like, we're not free until all the drugs are free. Like how do we get safe supply? My friends are dying from this stuff. My friends are going to jail from this stuff. How do we not go to jail anymore for these things? And I think that debate is warming up. It's still a debate though to me because, I thought the question was settled years ago, but it is surely not.
So
should taxpayer dollars go to keep people in jail for nonviolent offenses?
Absolutely not.
And also put them at risk of dying from an untainted supply?
Ethan Nadelman I interviewed him for the podcast a couple of years ago, and he put it really well because I've always had a little bit of a hard time with like, all drugs are the same, and the fact
they're certainly not the same.
They're not.
It's just what about like what penalties should be,
right?
Or
totally.
Like should the government be trying to keep people alive, or like, oh, fentanyl contamination's cool. Only like, 80,000 people a year are going to die. So we're fine with it. Or like, it's not that the drugs are the same. It's that what is the government's role in relation to drugs? And should we have a science-based drug policy? Totally.
Right.
What else should we have?
Well, in the way that Ethan described it, he's like, the First Amendment protects both good speech and not so great speech. Right. And he's like, that's how I think about it with drug policy. It's like with drug policy, regardless of how harmful the drug is, or potentially harmful the drug is. And as we know, this is all about context, because in some cases, cocaine can be used for surgery, or opiates can be used for pain, or methamphetamines can be used to help 6-year-olds focus, which is a whole different issue. But I think at the end of the day, it's like there are certain substances that science shows us are more beneficial to human health. Like psilocybin, LSD, neuroplasticity, even anti-inflammatory properties. And there are certain substances or drugs that are maybe less beneficial for human health. But these are all drugs. They should all be protected. People should be able to utilize them as they need, when they need. And none of them should be criminalized whatsoever, right? And so having that sort of basic fundamental aspect of protection, I think you can't cover the good if you also can't cover the quote unquote bad. And good and bad is very comparative, relative in this sense. But when he described that to me, I was like, I get it now. You know,
it's hard, right?
That makes sense because it is a natural human sort of impulse or right to alter our consciousness. And
so isn't hierarchy making, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And 99% of the harm comes from the fact that these are prohibited. 99% of it, right?
We know the dose, we knew the purity. But yeah, and I could sue the drug dealer for giving me something that wasn't what I thought it was. You know, imagine being able to trust the police again. I still feel very uncomfortable. I'm a white guy in America and I'm afraid of the police. Like that's ridiculous. Right. But I am, because I'm in this world.
It is, it's a tough one. It's complex, it's nuanced. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, all drugs should be decriminalized. People should be aware of their benefits and risks. They should know that it's a pure supply. And I find myself personally, I'm just less interested in drug policy and more interested in psychedelics, right? On a personal level as well. So it's like
when we're doing the government, like we're talking to politicians and stuff. Right. That's when it seems to me incumbent on us as people that want more healing in the world.
Yeah.
Like if we want more healing in the world, let's do also less harm.
Right.
And like stop harming people that way.
Well, then I think
so we can heal more.
Healing is important.
Yeah.
Right. Healing's super important. And I think another aspect that I've noticed is there was this Washington Post editorial that was published, I don't know, 2-3 months ago that you probably saw as well, about how people shouldn't be self-medicating with psychedelics.
Ugh. I was so frustrated by that headline. I didn't read the article. I was like running around my house yelling. Yelling about the tweet that posted it.
And the irony of it was, and I love Michael Pollan and what he's done for the space, but then Michael Pollan sort of retweeted it. And of course, a retweet is not necessarily endorsement, but there was this sort of sense of, we've opened Pandora's box now, especially with How to Change Your Mind that was published in 2018. A friend of mine who you may know as well, Dennis Walker, who does the Mycopreneur stuff, he made a really good point, which is like, in the 60s, we didn't have grow kits. Now everyone can just simply grow their own mushrooms, right? So it's like this whole model that you think is the way that psychedelics should roll out is not the way that it will roll out. And that's, I think, an important distinction.
You probably actually know this stuff already, but like theoretically, the FDA is going to keep all of us in line and only using government MDMA or whatever it is. Great, cool, whatever. But what's happening is engineers have figured out how to splice DNA into yeast bacterias and things. So these are
we going to talk about psilomethoxin now?
No, we're not going to go there. This is actually real, and it's in actual biotech.
I talked with Hamilton about this when I interviewed him. Yeah.
Yeah. So like algae can excrete amazing drugs in unique environments. So like in terms of deflating cartels, we're one invention away from like eliminating cartel control over cocaine through grow in democratizing cocaine manufacturing closets, small little like brew kits. Wow. So like, any smart engineer out there could take this, idea, learn about CRISPR and figure out how to do that and like radically democratize manufacture. And I think we're going to continue to see democratized manufacture and likewise with grow kits being kind of the most obvious aspect of that. Like it's going to be a really interesting ride from here. Like it's already been pretty weird and interesting.
It's like this whole mycelial network that's starting to emerge. I often call mushrooms the medicine of the people, that they can't be prohibited or criminalized. It's literally impossible unless we lived in a total fascist police state, And so all of these, even, we're at a business conference right now in the psychedelic space. We know there've been, I think, over $2 billion invested in the space at this point in time. And my bet is that only 10% of people who work with psychedelics will go through that FDA route, even,
at most, yeah.
At most. Only if, of course, MDMA does get approved, which we're still waiting to see, and psilocybin does get approved in 2027, and these other sort of interesting psychedelic drugs are also approved, which I think is likely. I do think is likely and could be seen by the end of this decade. But after people have that first experience and they start to meet and connect with community, right? This grow, gather, gift model of how mushrooms grow everywhere. Like, okay, do I want to pay $1,000 a month for health insurance to cover my $15,000, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy? Or do I want to pay $50 for a grow kit, or, $100 for enough mushroom medicine for the next year or 2 years, and just do it in sort of a church style community aspect where, I know I can trust the facilitators, the space has been held well. And I think that's also really important to emphasize with accessibility. It's like churches have figured this out pretty well, how to create accessibility. I grew up in a church myself, and every week we would do, a soup kitchen, and every week we'd have a food pantry, and homeless people in Grand Rapids, which is where I grew up, would come and they'd get food and, be able to be taken care of. And anyone can come to church. You don't have to pay to go to church. Now you tithe, right? You donate as part of that. And so I think looking at that model for how we roll out psychedelics, and we know there's, how many churches by now would you estimate there are, Joe? Like 500, 600,000?
I'm nervous for all of them.
Yeah, because only 3 are actually legal. Three, sorry, 2.
2.
UDV, Santa Diamond, then you have ONAC. But ONAC is not necessarily a church. That's a Native American church, but it's a little different, right?
Right, yeah. NAC, regular NAC for sure, which I'm learning is not exactly as clean a story as we want to think it is. Yeah. But yeah, there's so many ways forward. I actually did a project a couple years ago trying to get Christian leaders more educated, and it ended up like making a lot of groups do Christian retreats to Netherlands. I was like, guys, you could do this in your basement with like get some sort of therapist to donate their day and a prescriber, and you can be doing this in your church basement all day with your community doing amazing cap work.
Right.
And if you want to break the law, great, bring some mushrooms in, do it.
Yeah.
Like, imagine the Episcopal priest getting arrested for mushrooms. Like, amazing. Yeah. What good press.
Yeah.
So I'm always subversive,
Gotta be subversive.
I want
psychedelics
change.
Are nothing if not subversive.
I want so much change. And we'll figure it out. Cool. Like anything else we want to fit in?
Well, so you have a Vital cohort starting January?
Late January, I think.
So by the time this podcast is published, it will still be open. So if people want to learn more about Vital, where can they go to learn more?
vitalpsychedelictraining.com.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's an application. So fill that out. Hit us up if you have questions, info@Psychedelics Today, or socials, or wherever you want to hit us up. That's fine.
And then for your listeners, because that would be for our listeners, ours is the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. That's psychedeliccoaching.institute. And we have our next cohort that starts around the same time, early February. The retreat will be in Costa Rica in June 20 to 25. And then we also have a free community platform. You can go and download the Third Wave app. We, I think, have 3,000 members who are part of that. We have discussion on how to grow mushrooms and microdosing and, what's going on in the scientific and research aspect. So if you do want to join an engaged and thriving community, you can download Third Wave's community app from the App Store as well. And then thethirdwave.co is our domain.
This feels late to ask this, but like how many hours a week typically would somebody want to commit to your program?
So the first 3 months is a little bit more intense. It's probably anywhere from 8 to 10 hours a week. The intensive is full on for 6 days in Costa Rica. And then in the practicum, it probably goes down to maybe 3 hours a week because the practicum is a bit more spread out. Cool. So it might be 3 to 4 hours a week. So if the program is 10 months, that's on average probably 45 weeks. And it might be on average 6 hours. So it's, let me do the math quick, 270 hours or so.
Right on.
We'll even round down. It's like a 250 hour program is probably a good way to frame it.
Like softly, we're at like 4 to 5 hours a week.
Yeah.
That's probably on the low end, probably. But yeah, for a full year. Yeah.
And some people, we have like 3 books that we ask you to read as part of the theory. One of which is Pharmaconosis. Have you read Pharmaconosis?
No.
Oh, Dale Pendell. Do you know Dale Pendell?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm actually surprised I haven't read that one. Yeah, he's like a legend in this space.
It's fantastic. Yeah. And so I was looking for a book that like, what's an interesting book that's not just, here's all the science about, mushrooms and MDMA. So I have our students read Pharmaconosis because it has a deep dive on every psychedelic, but it includes like the historical context, the pharmacology, the sort of applied use, all that. And then right now, the other 2 books are Stealing Fire by Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel, And then a book called The Path of Least Resistance by a guy named Robert Fritz, who's like a composer, musician, artist. And that talks a lot about the creative orientation, which is a good book just to think about how you sort of sculpt the life that you want to live.
Super important in coaching. Yeah.
It is, in coaching in particular.
Yeah. All right.
This has been fun, Joe.
Yeah.
7 years in the making.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's been so long.
We should talk again soon. Thanks for your team reaching out and organizing this, and thanks for everything you're doing for the psychedelic world. I feel like we just need Shelby from Double Blind, and we'll have like the triage of psychedelic media companies.
Well, you guys both live in SoCal, so let's try to figure something out.
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah. This is an official invitation, Shelby, if you hear this.
All right, Paul. Thank you so much, and I hope we can do more.
Thanks, Joe.
And there you have it, Paul Austin, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed that one. Please share with a friend if you appreciated it. And please just keep getting educated wherever it is. We need people to know more and to do more in this space, be it advocacy or working with folks in a preparation or integration capacity or much more. So, all right, I think that's it for today's Psychedelics Today episode. Thank you all again for tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode. This is Joe Moore signing off. Bye-bye.